You may be more adaptive at the operational and tactical level because you're facing it every day, and you're not going back and looking at how it impacts your longer term strategic goals and objectives. There's an old saying in the military: there are many battlefields. There's the one in the COC, the operations center, which you see in maps and everything. There's the real one out there, and there's probably the 30,000 mile altitude that you can look down and maybe get the clearest picture. So there's different perspectives on the battlefield.
Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, you won't want to miss my conversation with General Tony Zinni as we explore why leaders must not fall in love with our plans. I'm honored to have him on the podcast. General Tony Zinni served in key leadership roles such as Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Central Command, Special Envoy to the Middle East, and has decades of military experience. Additionally, he's a New York Times bestselling author and holds a Ph.D. in Interdisciplinary Leadership. Stay tuned until the end, where we'll reveal the scientifically proven ways to avoid falling into the trap of loving your plan. General, thank you for joining me today on the Science of Leadership, and thank you for your service to our nation.
Pleasure to be with you, Tom.
When we talked before, you offered a leadership maxim that really struck me and is the topic of our conversation today. And that was, don't fall in love with your plan. For our listeners, what do you mean by that maxim, don't fall in love with your plan?
Well, Eisenhower once said, plans are nothing, planning is everything. And I think what he intended there, and probably from obviously his experiences, is that you build a plan that comes out of a process of planning. You're invested in it. You put a lot into it. You want it to work, obviously. Your ego and your reputation, could be at stake. And you become so tied to your plan that when events, as they eventually will, begin to change and unforeseen things happen, you have an inability, and your organization has an inability to adapt and adjust. As a matter of fact, if they're too invested in the plan, they don't see changing opportunities and changing threats until it's too late, or they're reacting later than they could have and adjusted better. So I think that's a lesson certainly we in the military have learned over and over again. And it just means that plans basically are a product of a process. They're a starting point. They're not going to last long, given all the possibilities of what can change and happen. And you have to build in flexibility and adaptability and that mindset, with your staff and with your subordinate leaders.
Yeah, thanks for that, helping flesh out that sort of definition of what we're talking about today. Now, thinking back on your career, you've been involved in some of the most complex military decisions and operations in modern history. Do you have a good story from your career where a plan had to be adapted or scrapped, and how did you handle that as a leader?
Yeah, two instances. One was when during the Operation Desert Storm in the north, when the Kurds attempted to rebel, Saddam crushed them and drove them into the hills of Turkey. I was in the European Command. We rapidly formed a joint task force, went down, and our immediate mission was to go into those hills in Turkey and try to provide humanitarian support. So our initial deployment, organization of the force plan, if you will, was all geared to a short-term provision of humanitarian assistance until something like the United Nations and others took over the mission. It turned out, as we went along, the plan evolved to bringing them back, the Kurds, into Iraq, and then eventually not just to camps on the edge of the border, but then eventually back home to their homes, which meant we had to clear the Iraqi forces out of there, basically issue demarche to the Iraqis at no fly, no drive zone. And that had to be maintained for 8 years until we went back into Iraq. It was nothing like what we intended when we went in. The mission looked very short term. The same thing happened to us in Somalia. When I went with the initial deployment as the director of operations for the Joint Task Force, President Bush 41 had actually made the decision to send us in after he lost the election. It was strictly on a humanitarian basis, and we were to be a short-term mission just to provide security until the UN could expand its operation. We were looking at maybe several weeks. In 19 days, we had secured the area, and the UN wasn't taken over. There was no provision to pass it to anybody. And basically, we were stuck. And I think everybody understands, 3-4 years later, we were still committed to Somalia. And the mission grew and went beyond just a short-term security mission. And we all know the Black Hawk Down Day story. And eventually, I went back to command the Joint Task Force, Combined Task Force, to protect the withdrawal of the UN forces, over all that time. So that took many evolutions, and obviously was nothing like what we saw as our original mission and plan.
Sure. That's a great example of, as you say, evolution of the plan and how that can play out. And specifically, as you're talking about Somalia, the humanitarian impacts that has and the need to be able to evolve. From a scientific standpoint, when we talk about the need to change the plans and so forth, research tells us that sticking rigidly to a plan, especially in dynamic environments, whether they be military or corporate, healthcare, whatever it may be, so many environments are dynamic, but when we stick rigidly to those, that can lead to decision paralysis and cognitive bias where we become blind to new data, just as you were sort of mentioning. And this harkens back to the work of Nobel Prize winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who highlighted so many of our cognitive biases, like overconfidence in a plan and how that can cloud our judgment and make it harder to see when we need to adapt, just like you're saying. On the other hand, there was this study by Plowman and Duchamp that showed that organizations with leaders who are adaptive, who are constantly reevaluating and adjusting their plans based on real-time data, have greater success, especially in those uncertain conditions. And so does that resonate well with you? It certainly seems like from those couple of examples you shared, those data do.
Right. I think there's a couple important points to be made. One is, I think it behooves a leader or a commander, regardless of whether it's business, military, whatever, is to provide an atmosphere of first to be able to challenge the plan from your subordinates, from your staff, that it's okay to realize and to question if they see something that isn't going the way we had intended. And that's important. And sometimes leaders end up, because of their ego, wanting to drive home a plan. And it goes back to how the plan is developed. If you have too much of your personal reputation and ego invested in it, rather than a collective ownership of building that plan and a collective license to challenge and question and to keep it open and flexible and adaptable, that leads to a problem of the plan not being able to be adapted. I'd say one other point. In most organizations, especially large organizations, definitely the military and large corporations that I've been in, you have a strategy, you have a sort of an operational design, and you have your day-to-day tactics. And it's important to keep those aligned. Sometimes you may be more adaptive at the operational and tactical level because you're facing it every day. And you're not going back and looking at how it impacts your longer term strategic goals and objectives. So you aren't adapting at one level where you may be at another level. Then you get out of alignment, and that will create problems. It means your vision, your goals and all, you're not looking for the chances to change those, either because they become irrelevant or challenged, or because there was an opportunity you didn't take advantage of because you didn't see, but it was seen at a lower level. So those things have to constantly be viewed in conjunction with each other to make sure your day-to-day operations are in sync with your strategy, and making sure your strategy isn't just designed, put on a shelf, but it has to be a living kind of understanding in how you're going to achieve your vision.
Yes, sir. That first component, creating the environment where you can receive inputs from those you're leading and others, so critical. And then your idea, just with regard to being able to look at the landscape and not be rigidly. I'm trying to think of the term with regards to plants where they just are adherent, let's say, to the ground and the rock that they're on. But that sort of mental picture where you're just locked in and you can't let go of it to your own detriment. And so we've seen that over and over. I know you've heard this a million times, I'm sure, but it reminds me of General Colin Powell's admonition, don't tie your position to your ego. And it reminds me of countless historical examples where leaders failed spectacularly because they did fall in love with their plan or tied it to their ego. We could cite all sorts from a military context. We could talk about Napoleon's terrible march into Russia in the winter that was repeated by Germany also. Or we could talk about Blockbuster sticking with VHS tapes when the digital landscape was unfolding. But one that jumped to my mind was the story of Kodak. Kodak dominated film-based photography, but what many listeners may not actually know is they invented and patented the first digital camera, but they were so committed, their plan was so committed to film, they refused to move toward digital photography. And so as a result, the company that was the name, the face of photography in the world, collapsed in the 1980s and 90s and then went bankrupt in 2012 after losing $30 billion. Now, if we contrast that with a different story that is told with reverence throughout the Silicon Valley, that's the story of Intel. And so Intel was originally a memory chip company. That was their plan. That was what they did. That was all they did. It was who they were as a company, as an entity. But the memory chip business started to really slow down and things weren't looking so good. And so as they began watching things slow at Intel, the co-founders, Andy Grove and Gordon Moore, were facing effectively an existential crisis of their corporation. And so one day Grove and Moore were in Grove's office and Andy Grove posed a question. He said, if we got kicked out and the board brought in a new CEO, what do you think he would do? And unhesitatingly, Gordon Moore said he would get us out of memories. That is, Moore really thought a new CEO would leave Intel's identity as memory chip company and would shift to the new and growing field of microprocessors. And so Andy Grove responded and said, why shouldn't you and I walk out the door, come back in, and do it ourselves? And with that decision, Intel went on to become what we know of Intel, all because they were able to move away from their plan to a better one. So I'm sure you're familiar with both of those cases, but does that resonate with you and in your experience?
Yeah, it does. And both in my military experience and after retirement in my corporate and other experiences, even in watching, I had about 12 peace mediation processes that I was sent off to do by State Department and others, and watching different parties negotiate and where they were coming from. And it always struck me that if you don't understand where let's use the corporate or business terminology, where your market is, and more importantly, where your place in that market is. The examples you gave, which are classic business school examples, is you lost sight of your market. You lost sight of your customers. You lost sight of where you are in the market and what you are. The classic examples that are usually given are companies that expand into areas that aren't their core business.
Mm.
They jump into these areas, and pretty soon they've lost a definition of who they are, or the market changed on them. And their definition of who they are, they're rigidly sticking to it, but there's a need to change because the market has moved on from that. And I've seen that many, many times, particularly in the corporate world, where if you're not constantly reassessing your market in a military sense, reassessing your environment, the threat, where your interests are, where where technology is in terms of military support or even industry, you're going to lose focus. So it's important, to have those that monitor that and to invest in that into an organization. In the military, usually it's your intelligence capability, heavy investment in that, and make sure they're involved in every decision, that you aren't making decisions separate from those that are gathering information for you. I had an example of when I was a commander, U.S. Central Command. I called in my director of intelligence, Army 2-star, and I asked him a question, and he said, "Tell me why you're asking that question." And I said, "Well, just answer the question. I got 4 stars, you got 2. Answer the question." He said, "Well, I don't want to answer it unless you tell me why you're asking it, because I can give you the answer, but I'm not sure that's the best answer, or you're asking the right question." And so when, this led to a conversation, and I realized I wasn't asking the right question. And had he given me the answer, it would have led me down the wrong path. And one of the lessons I drew from that is that, that gatherer of intelligence in this case, or information, or the assessment of the environment, has to be involved in the decision-making process. In the military, we're organized into operations and plans and that sort of thing. And there's a tendency in the military for the commander to be very closely tied to their operations officer, director, whatever. And you tend to make plans like that. And times you forget to bring in, say, the planners that are working on your strategy and making sure what you're doing is in line with your strategy, or maybe causes the strategy to be changed. That's a different department or staff section. To make sure that your intelligence director or officer are brought in, because they know the environment. And so, my point being, decisions have to be done in a collective way. If they're done in isolation, or they're stovepiped in a certain way with just certain individuals and certain capacities that you have in your organization, they tend not to get the whole picture, and that causes you to miss something, and builds in inflexibility.
Yeah, there's so many rich things there. The idea of shared decision making on some level, but also recognizing we have a singular perspective. As much as we may try to broaden our aperture, we have limitations as humans, and so bringing those in from different people helps us so greatly to be better informed and to make better decisions. And that's clear from all sorts of studies and just human experience. You've seen these rapidly changing situations in your career. I think a question I have is, you've hit on this some, but what do you think are the biggest pitfalls that leaders face when they get too attached to their plan?
Well, obviously, I think if you fall in love with your plan, you put blinders on. You don't see changes, or you don't build in the ability to collect information on the changes that are happening around you. To give you an example, I was an observer at a large exercise, and it was a corps level unit, and that I was in there for the after action review. And what had happened is, in this computer generated exercise, when the command had ordered an attack, the intent was for the attack to break through the first line of defense. What they had done when they designed their plan is they drew all the battlefield geometry you would see in an operations center, And somebody assumed where the main line of defense was, the first main line, and drew a phase line. And so the order said attack to phase line, whatever it was, blue or whatever, assuming that got you through the first line of defense. In reality, the first line of defense was further out than that. So when they attacked to the phase line as directed, they were short of the main line defense and found them engaged with the enemy. And, in the exercise, it was interesting watching the commander, who's an Army 3-star, highly respected, someone I admired greatly. He was saying, we fell in love with our battlefield geometry. We fell in love with our plan. We thought the picture in the operations center and all those things on the map and the overlays and, now computer, obviously screens, we thought that was reality, and so that wasn't reality. That's the kind of thing you can fall into if you aren't open to making sure people understand your intent. My intent is not to attack the phase line blue. My intent is to crack the first line of defense. I need to say that. Now, I think it's at phase line blue. I could be wrong. That tells my lead elements, if they haven't hit the first line of defense, the commander wants us to go through the first line of defense. It's further out. So by explaining and articulating things in the form of intent, builds in flexibility and shows truly what you're after, and you're not bound up by the mechanics of the process, and that becomes the reality. There's an old saying in the military, there are many battlefields. There's the one in the COC, the operations center, which you see in maps and everything. There's the real one out there, and there's probably the 30,000 mile altitude that you can look down and maybe get the clearest picture. So there's different perspectives on the battlefield. As a company commander in Vietnam, I was shocked when I came back after really getting into some hellacious firefights to listen to a division brief that said last week was a quiet week in the division zone. I said, excuse me, it wasn't quiet for me. But from the division perspective, it was what I was doing was minor. For me, I was beating them off with baseball bats. Didn't seem minor to me. So, perspectives can be different too. And you've got to incorporate all that into your calculation and your flexibility. In the military, we build obviously branch plans and sequels and that sort of thing into planning. We try to, if we see things that we're not sure about, we make assumptions on, we try to deal with those in the form of alternate branches of our plan, and that somewhat can help. Even the creation of those things lets everybody know this may not go the way we absolutely plan it. So let's think about the potential alternatives, which actually could change as we go along and we get into this.
Yeah. You've previously said the enemy gets a vote, just as you've outlined, no matter how well thought out your plan is. What you think is going to happen may not, in fact, probably won't happen because of various unforeseen factors and things, whether those are physical enemies or markets or corporations or other things, and how those evolve and emerge. And you've hit on it a little bit, but how does that reality that the enemy gets a vote frame how you think about your planning, specifically when you're thinking about, or do you think about how might they respond? What might they be doing that we aren't thinking about? How do you go about framing that in your mind as you're planning?
Well, as a company grade officer in Vietnam, 2 tours of duty there as a lieutenant and a captain. One thing I learned is when you're in a firefight, I had conditioned myself after a number of experiences is to start thinking not only what we intended to do, how we tactically wanted to deploy and deliver fires and maneuver. I was thinking about what's that guy that I'm fighting thinking about. And in one instance, it happened to be, as I was a company commander, we were attacking a hill, and I was wounded, and I had by that time learned to listen to enemy fire. You could tell their weapons had a distinctive sound if you were experienced enough. And I began to hear that beside the fire in front of us, I began to hear it more, moving to the left. And it suddenly caused me to look over to the left and see a small rise or piece of high ground. And I realized that enemy's trying to get up on that high ground where he'll have an advantage from the direction and the fires that he could deliver. Immediately told one of my platoon commanders, get up there and get a machine gun up there and get a squad, And I could see and hear, literally hear, the race and the fight for the top of that hill. And finally, our squad, got there first and delivered fires, and the enemy fell back. So it wasn't a matter of getting myopically focused on what I had to do. That's important, what I thought I had to do. But also, what's the other guy doing, reacting to what I'm doing? Or what's he doing to try to gain the momentum or the advantage? And that gives you a broader perspective now when you can meld the two views. And if I'm in his shoes, what am I trying to do? And I think that has to come into your thinking day to day. If you're in business, what is my competition trying to do? Where are they challenging me? Where are they getting into my signature or my core capabilities? Are they challenging me there? Are they expanding in a different direction that I haven't thought of? So, I know from my business experience, trying to get in the head of your competition and defining your competition is key to being successful. You can't only think of it from your perspective, but what are those guys out there that are trying to compete for my business? What are they trying to do?
Yeah. My thought came from when you were talking about this rise in Vietnam and, over there's this opportunity. We need to go after it. But I was thinking conversely about sometimes we develop these plans and we see these, what we think are opportunities, and nobody else seems to get them. They don't see them, or at least from our perspective, they don't see them. And so how do we differentiate between we are innovative and have come up with this great plan and this idea versus here's the competition who is smart, agile, thoughtful, analytical, and yet they're not going in this direction? Is it because there's something over there they know that I don't? Or do you see what I'm getting at? Like,
Yes.
how do we differentiate that? Or do you have a good method?
I think it's clearly important. If you see an opportunity, you first have to do the analysis. If I saw it, we saw it, why didn't our competition see it? Are we that much better in terms of our analytical capability? What is the barrier for the competition to take advantage of this? Let's assume they've seen it, but they haven't acted on it. What is the reason? And I think you have to ask yourself that question. To use a military example, when I was a young lieutenant, I was an advisor with the Vietnamese Marines. And one day I was back with the operations officer, the battalion commander, and the senior advisor were gone. We were just the two of us. We were on a village, just everybody had kind of taken a break. And suddenly this woman came up and said that I know where the Viet Cong are. And, if you could come right away, they're having a meeting. And we gathered up a bunch of troops, because the units were scattered out. And we went off and bigger in life, there was somebody there. They fired at us and they moved and fired at us and we were chasing. Suddenly I get a call on the radio and my counterpart gets a call from his boss saying, stop, get your butt back here. And we were just, oh man, we're on them. We're going to get them. So we get called back and we're all kind of upset. We come back and my senior advisor, he is livid that, I went off and chased him. And the Vietnamese battalion commander, this guy was a real hero. He had several silver stars from fights being with the Americans and that had been given to him. He said he wanted to see me. And he told the senior American advisor, don't chew him out. He called me and he said, why do you think they were leading you on? Why do you think it was so easy? Why did you keep going? And I said, well, we had them. We were advantaged. He said, if you had them, you know the enemy by now. Don't you think they could have broken contact and scattered? Do you think you were being fished in, maybe to an ambush further on? And as I thought about it, I said, he's absolutely right. We were being led in. We were so motivated, enthusiastic. We were charging, we were shooting at them. And then it dawned on me, they never broke contact, and they never, demonstrated they had the firepower to take us on. It's always like, look, we're just weak and you're chasing us down. And that did not make sense, because they were much more highly skilled and tactical than that. That was the case. They were trying to lead us into an ambush, and we were falling for it, myself and the other Vietnamese lieutenant. So, he said, remember that, it was a great lesson for me. If you see an opening and you go through it and it's easy, or an opportunity and you want to seize on it, you got to ask yourself, why didn't anybody else see this? And is this a real opportunity?
Yeah. It's reminiscent of Lieutenant General Hal Moore's thought process. What's happening that shouldn't be happening? What isn't happening that should be happening? And so a little bit of that, right? Like the Viet Cong in that situation weren't behaving the way they typically should behave, and so must be something awry there. That's good. So when we talk about, just think about more about the science of this idea, the research has shown that leaders who remain adaptive, even when they're, when they've poured a significant amount of effort and energy into their plan, tend to outperform those who rigidly follow the script. And so the key there is something that psychologists call cognitive flexibility. There were studies by Stephen Zaccaro and his colleagues, as well as Uelbein and others, that showed that leaders who are cognitively flexible, that is, can quickly shift their strategy based on new information, are more successful in these dynamic environments. And I think that you're describing that sort of mindset when you talk about the ability to have changed the plans, and also the cognitive flexibility that we were kind of hitting on there, to say, what is awry here? So I think that all those play in. So General Zinni, for our listeners, many of whom are aspiring leaders or current leaders, and whether it be healthcare, business, the military, and so forth, what advice do you have for them as far as how can they avoid falling in love with their plan while still maintaining the discipline to execute the plan?
Well, I think it's important to have a process, focus on the process. It's not necessarily the product of the process, that's the plan. That could be flexible. And to have a process that works, and constantly look at the process and update it, and making sure that your ability to develop plans and develop your strategy and your day-to-day operations are based on solid principles, and you're constantly testing those principles, like knowledge of the market and that sort of thing. The second thing is to empower your people. In other words, ownership of the process and what we do has to belong to everybody in the organization. And so everybody should believe they have a vested interest. I had an example of we were watching the Iranians react to the Taliban had killed some Iranian emissaries that they sent into Iran. This is before any war we were involved in, and I was at CENTCOM. And we thought for sure that as a result of killing those envoys, that the Iranians were going to invade Afghanistan. They had moved forces up along the border. I was up. We activated our crisis action team. I was in the operations center, had all my generals around me. They were looking at the movement. We were all tied up in it. Generals are telling me, they'll have the ability to go in 2 hours or 1 hour, and everything else. And I hear this little voice in the back saying, "Sir, they're not going to attack." turn around, and it's this young staff sergeant, Army staff sergeant. And I said, who are you? He said, sir, I'm Staff Sergeant so-and-so. I work in your Joint Intelligence Center. So I said, well, what do you do there? He said, well, amongst other things, I follow Iranian, military, and I follow particularly Iranian logistics. If you'll notice, they haven't moved any logistics forward. It's a bluff. That they're moving combat forces forward for some reason, but an invasion, isn't going to go down since they've moved no logistics forward. Now, after looking at it, I go, duh, of course. But, if you don't empower, if he didn't feel confident in bringing that up in front of all the generals, then we would have missed that. And it's important that everybody feels empowered to contribute. And everybody feels, I own this plan as much as everybody else. This is not the general's or the colonel's plan. This is our plan. And I have a vested interest in it, and I'm allowed to input and give my view on it, where my expertise is considered valuable by those that lead. I always tell my classes that I give on leadership in the military that the commander has to be involved right from the beginning with his staff. We have this sort of artificial construct in the military that the staff goes off and does all this planning, then comes back in and gives you courses of action. I've never had courses of action developed separately by the staff. Our course of action evolved. And the way grew up in the military and the commanders I've had before me, they were involved in the planning right from the beginning. And so as their thought process was evolving, their intent was forming, as we were getting more information, they were with us. The staff was able to input, the commander is able to input, and it's a collective development as opposed to subordinate commands doing their thing, staff doing their thing, commander coming in and then giving the final word and then blessing it. That's a disjointed process. So even whether it's business or whatever, you have to have that sort of collective approach.
Yeah, that idea of empowering those that we lead to be able to speak into situations came up over and over in my study of the 4-star generals and admirals. There were so many examples of people saying, but for this one staff sergeant or whomever it may have been, we would have really fouled up. But the environment was such that they could speak into it. Now, is that true for every military installation and command? No, in my experience, haven't been in the military. No, but for the really good ones, I think that's the case, and so I think that's exceptionally valuable insight. Speaking of the you and the 50 other 4-stars and generals and admirals that I interviewed, going through that process of working through all those data, I kind of identified 4 commonly recurring ways that leaders can avoid falling in love with their plan or tying it to their ego. And so, first of all, surround yourself with capable people who offer insight and perspective, and then allow them to challenge your plans. Exactly what you just said. So that resonates very well. The second was allow others to be major contributors to the plan so that it isn't solely yours. You talked about that also, specifically with regard to people buy into things that they help co-create. The third is develop multiple contingencies, which could be stated plan to change the plan. And then finally, recognize that success isn't the absence of failure, which can be hard for those of us who historically have been, quote, achievers and successful or what have you. But success isn't the absence of failure. Rather, it's the result of the repeated recognition of the minute-to-minute micro failures and constant redirection from those and the current plan toward one that will work in the present context and allow you to keep moving forward toward achieving the goal. So those are the 4 things that I identified in the conversations and analysis of all those data, and you certainly hit on some of that in your description. So I appreciate that. Any thoughts about those four that come to mind after I've talked about them?
Yeah, I would say to sort of amplify what you said on the last point, we now have adopted something called deep battle. And deep battle is the way for a commander to think ahead in time and space. And we usually do that at three levels. In other words, there is a current fight that's going on. We're engaged. It used to be that was the fight. You waited till that was resolved or whatever, and then you went on. You leave that, you monitor it and you leave it to your subordinate elements. But you then look at the next phase of this mission. So the commander now and his staff, you have an element of your staff that's looking at the next phase. What's going to come out of this phase? What's happening now that's creating opportunities or challenges that's going to shape, what we foresaw as the second phase, and maybe you need to make adjustments. And then you have another element, which is future plans. And future plans is the next mission. If we successfully achieve this mission, then what would be, and it allows you to think ahead, to fight battles in time and space in your mind, in your planning mind, and look at this. Creates a seamless progression in what you're doing. So that kind of thinking creates a better analysis of what's going on, because you can't think like that unless it's the term we use is shaping the battlefield, that we are shaping things in the way we had intended. Or if that's not happening, what is the shape that's coming out now, and where do we see our advantages, or where do we see our vulnerabilities? So that kind of deep battle thinking is not only a means of making sure you have a seamless way of progressing, unlike we did in the past, and now we have capabilities allow us to do that, but it allows you to think more deeply about what's happening and creating those either opportunities or challenges.
Yeah, it is. And you've just hit on it. The planning process is in itself evolutionary. As an organization, the military has increasingly improved planning capabilities over the decades, and I think that's been obviously beneficial to the continuance of our nation and so forth. I have one last question I wanted to ask you, which is, if there was a time in your career where kind of the plan was failing or had failed, or you had to move back from the plan, how do you maintain the morale of those that you're leading when they recognize, oh, this is not going well? How do you maintain the morale to get done what you need to get done to kind of extricate, whether literally or sort of philosophically, from a given situation?
Yeah, I think several situations. I mean, obviously, I've been through Vietnam, been through Somalia, I did an assessment in Iraq and Afghanistan after I retired, and I could see, the frustration, because, like as I mentioned before, we have the strategic, operational, and tactical levels, and the greatest frustration comes when you're achieving what you need to achieve at the operational and tactical levels. You're winning every battle, if you will. Mm-hmm. But you're not progressing toward the strategic objective. You're not winning the war. You're winning the battles. And then it gets more frustrating when you realize from the ground level why you're not winning the war. In Vietnam, as a young officer, trying to understand where we were going and living with the Vietnamese and in their villages and meeting the people, I could see that unless we changed the government in South Vietnam, we had all those corrupt generals, one after another. We weren't going to win that war. That was one flaw. The second flaw is, as long as the enemy had sanctuary, as long as when we beat him up, he could cross a border and recuperate, rearm, rehab, and then come back. Then it was a clash of wills. And, and if he was willing to fight for 30 years, we knew fully we weren't going to fight for 30 years. It wasn't going to happen. And so the frustration, it always caused me, as we all are students of history, I look back at the decisions after World War II, and I saw, like, General Marshall realized we will continue to have these conflicts unless we change things. And the Marshall Plan changed things in Europe. MacArthur saw that in Japan. I mean, obviously, he was left with a devastated Japan, but how do you rebuild it? How do you change it and make it a democracy? Preserve certain things that may be culturally important, but bring it into a point where it changes and we don't have this. And I think somehow we lost that. We lost that picture in Vietnam. I talked to people in the villages of Vietnam that said, I want the war to stop because I can't fight for those coup generals and I don't want to be a communist. So now I just don't, I just want it to stop. Mm-hmm. 30 years of war, the Japanese, the French, and then the US. Were we doing the same thing in Iraq? Did we change the government? Did we make it something that people were willing to fight for? Same thing in Afghanistan. Was the government we installed or allowed to be installed in Kabul going to be responsive to the people? I remember this woman in a village of Vietnam saying to me, what am I supposed to die for? What is my son supposed to die for?
Wow.
And to me, if I can't answer that question, and I'm trying to put myself in her place, we miss the entire point of what we're doing. And when you get that question from your own troops, laying in a hospital, an evacuation hospital in Da Nang, shot up alongside me, some of my troops, and one of my troops said to me, "Why are we here?" He was shot in the leg, and big athletic kid, and, he shattered his ankle around. And if I can't answer that, and not because we're not doing what we know, we are out there fighting and winning our fights at a price. Something's wrong, and it strikes you if we're seeing it from this level, why is it being seen from another level? Why is that not getting, to the people that make strategic decisions, not understanding what's happening? The point that to be drawn from what I just said is from those that are at the top that are making political and strategic decisions, they need to get a feel for the battlefield. Mm-hmm. They need to understand what's happening on the ground. You can deceive yourself. You can think, well, I opened some girls' schools in this province. Look, we're making progress. Are you really making progress? You're not building an education institution nationwide. So you get deceived by small things because you want to be deceived. You want to believe. Mm-hmm. And you're not seeing it from, as I mentioned before, that 30,000 foot perspective. Are you really changing something? I mean, I think this is what Marshall understood with the Marshall Plan. You have to change something at a level that builds institutions, that builds a change in democratization and however you make the change. But if you don't, you're going to repeat it, or you're going to eventually be worn out by the expense of it, in human terms and in financial and other terms.
That's an entire, well, to some degree, a book even, right? I mean, this is one of your books that I've read, and I'll show the other one here in a second, but Before the First Shots Are Fired. And in that, you touch on a number of those same sorts of themes. What's the bigger picture? What are we really doing? And how are we thinking about this long before we engage in our plan and so forth? So that's a book that I would recommend to listeners. And then the other one, Leading the Charge, is one, and you've written at least one other, I think, The Battle for Peace, is another book, and I'm probably not aware of you may have written even more than that, but certainly those two I've read and enjoyed and inform this conversation even further. So, General Zinni, sir, it's an honor, a privilege. Thank you so much for being on The Science of Leadership, sharing your wisdom, experience, and knowledge with me and our listeners.
Well, thank you for having me, Tom. I enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.